This our regular panelist here. We have Professor Noah Midamba with us, who's the chairperson, or the vice chancellor, I should say, of KCA University, and an expert on foreign policy and defense. We do have with us as well, joining us this morning, Dr. Mustafa Yusuf Ali, who is a conflict and resolution and national security expert. We do have with us as well Dr. Hassan Kanenja. I introduced him at the top of the hour. He's a director at the Horn Institute, Irunga Houghton, who is the executive director of Amnesty International Kenya, and Ambassador Erastus Moincha, who is the chairperson of African Capacity Building Foundation and also the chairperson of Trademark East Africa and the former deputy chair of the African Union. So let's just begin from that front yesterday, and a lot had been happening as far as corruption debate is concerned, that yes, this particular side of the party or this particular side of a divide, which is the opposition, so to speak, is targeting Deputy President William Ruto as far as corruption is concerned. And this, so to speak, was creating a lot of tension. Maybe from your perspective, where was this headed? And this particular gesture that we saw yesterday, did it really diffuse the tension, or is just maybe, made it sort of taper off a bit, but there's something simmering underneath? Let's just begin with you, Ambassador.
Yeah, good morning, Debal.
Morning.
First of all, if you look at the very spirit of building bridges initiative by President Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga, it was to reduce tension in the country and unite the country. And if you listen to the statement the President made in Parliament and other fora, he has always emphasized that we should never allow our country to go into kind of civil war like we have had. I mean, 2007 was, we came back from a precipice that would have gone into a full-scale civil war. Now, the only difference is that what is now happening came on the heels of the fight against corruption and the statements that have been made by both sides. Some looking at individuals who they see as very corrupt, and some, defending the position, saying they're being targeted. And of course, you saw what happened over the weekend when the president was in Namibia, when he made it clear that he is going to go full blast in terms of fighting corruption, and that he will not spare anybody. And the speculation then was ripe as to what does that mean. Now, what this has done is, of course, to reduce that tension, and it will keep the politicians guessing, because the president is perhaps giving an indication, and he has always said, let's focus on 2022. My only small tweak here is, I hope those that, were arguing that we should go slow on corruption don't seem to see that they are now winning, and that the fight against corruption reduces its energy. I think that would be the only part I'm worried about. But the reducing tension, it's always good. I mean, I have always believed that a peaceful solution of any situation is a preferred route. And anything that we can do to reduce tension is good. Right. But we should never then give up, because corruption is going to really jeopardize this country in the long run.
Right, thank you. Dr. Hassan Kanenja, do you think the gesture diffused tension?
If we say the gesture diffused tension, first of all, we'll be assuming there was tension between the president and the deputy president. Now, we do not know, because none of them has said there's tensions between them. It is.
But do you expect them to say there's tension between them?
Well, it's our speculation.
But by the goings, you can actually just decipher for yourself if there is tension or not.
There is tensions between the lieutenants.
Yes.
Yeah, but I don't know if there's tensions between them. Sometimes puppies fight each other a lot, and when actually the big dogs are doing just fine. So I would not jump into conclusion and say there's tensions, but in case there is, then it's helpful. However, having said that, I do not think we should have the optics of lessening tensions at the expense of fighting corruption. We have stated in this country, on this show many times that corruption is a national security issue. Perhaps more than any other threat facing this country, more than terrorism, because corruption actually also aids terrorism a lot. Yeah, and so if we do not deal with it because we're afraid of having feelings of puppies, it's going to be very dangerous. We have to be firm in the war against terrorism, or rather in the war against corruption, because it affects every aspect of our society. Now, so if we make a supposition that there were actually tensions between our two leaders, of course, it's going to be helpful to try and calm down, some nerves, but that's not going to be a lasting thing. If, in fact, the war on corruption is going to be sidelined, at a later date, we still have to face the reality. And I would like the president to understand that majority of Kenyans are actually behind him with regard to the war on corruption. Now, I can see some of our legislators every day doing very dishonorable things. I don't even know why they qualify to be called honorable members, by defending, before they even look at the facts. I don't know whether they've been smoking weed too much or whether they have so much money. How about we let the law follow its course to utmost conclusion? I do not think anybody in this panel right now, if they say they're going to be investigated on how they got or they bought their bicycle, they're going to be worried about it. Why? Because we have not, as Ambassador said, we have not been anyone's got.
Good.
And so if we're all innocent, why should we be afraid of the war on corruption, or at least investigations in that case? Now, we should not be doing, we can't say, well, why are you asking where I got my watch, but you've not asked about the other person's watch? No. Everybody should carry their own cross. And my assessment is, I think this should continue. Those who are going to be found innocent should not be maligned. Let them be set free and live their citizens, rather their lives as Kenyan citizens, without any suspicions, because the moment you start complaining that you're being targeted, chances are people start suspecting you that, are you culpable? Why are you afraid? So I don't think we should move away from that.
All right. Good morning.
Morning. So there are a couple of things. I think with the proposed impeachment that has been declared by Senior Counsel and also Senator James Orengo, I think what's going to be interesting about it is what's the legal basis for this. So there are a number of issues, and I think the cartoon picks up that initially quite well, which is, do you impeach both the president and the deputy president because they are considered to be a package? Or are you able to distinguish the deputy president separately, particularly if you're going after issues of insubordination or, subversion of government duty, which I think will be a difficult one. The second one really would be whether you base this impeachment on the grounds of lifestyle audit, and you do an analysis of all the assets and the properties that the deputy president owns, and proceed on these grounds. I think this could be the second area that he may be thinking about. But I think for me, what's completely kind of baffling is the continued argument that somehow all the war against corruption is unfairly targeting the deputy president. Because I think if you started on that premise, you would have to start off by accepting that the deputy president is at the source of corruption. What we do know is that we have something like about 16 billion shillings that has been frozen in terms of assets. We have a number of cabinet secretaries going back and forth to the Directorate of Criminal Investigation. We have a number of individuals who are in court, and they're no less than probably 1 trillion shillings worth of government finances that is being looked at by our courts as we speak right now. Now, at the moment, the one person that is not in the court is the deputy president. So I can't understand how the argument holds water, because if that was really the case, then surely a targeting of the deputy president would have him at the forefront of some of these cases. And as far as we can see, none of this is happening. So I think this is purely speculation on the part of the MPs that we've seen, led by I think it's Honorable Dindo and Honorable Baraza, among others. I think the meeting yesterday was an interesting one. I think the State of the Nation address is coming up. And it is possible that, and it should be the case, that actually the president and the deputy president should discuss something as weighty as the State of the Nation address. So we'll wait and see. But as we know, the tensions within the Jubilee Party are at a point now where all the gloves are off.
Right. Thank you. Professor Normi Damba, good morning.
Morning, Dubal. I agree with my colleagues here. President Theodore Roosevelt once said, to educate a person in mind and not in moral is to educate a menace to the society. The point is very clear, Dubal. The national security threat, number one, is corruption. And number two was ethnic conflict. And since the handshake, ethnic conflicts had sort of moved to number 5, based on my study. We must not and cannot move our eye on the prize, which is to eliminate corruption in this country. Corruption is the root of all evil. Corruption has taken away our moral fabric. Corruption has denied youth and the people of Kenya opportunities to make this country a better place. And therefore, we must continue not only to pray for our president, but to believe that he's keeping his eye on the prize and that the Kenya people and law enforcement is behind him. All this other stuff, all this political gamemanship is side source. Let law enforcement do their job. Let the culprit be brought before the court and let them be locked away so that Kenya can move ahead with developing the country. We cannot afford to retreat from our fight of corruption.
Fantastic. Unless you've got anything else to add, we can move on and also talk.
You know, Dibal, I don't know whether I thought about this yesterday, and I had a conversation with colleagues. Is it me who's looking at this differently? You know, Trump meets Pence every other week, sends him around the world to do business for him. They trust one another. Magufuli meets Suluhu, the deputy president in Tanzania, every other week. They have working lunch. You know, any president meets their deputies every other day. They have working lunches, breakfast, to actually deal with the issues. You know, that Kenya has been reduced to this, that we even have a headline, and it's actually a news headline that a president is meeting his deputy.
Front page.
I'm lost. And I don't know whether we are moving towards becoming really a shithole country, Dibal. And I know and understand why, you know, it's news perhaps that the president is meeting his deputy, because they are at loggerheads. In any country that respects itself, if a president or if a deputy does not agree with the president, even on a policy matter, a simple policy matter, that deputy resigns. We shouldn't be having this situation, Dibal. And you know, there's a slang in the ghettos, tunabebewa kimandazi. That's exactly what is happening in this country, in my view.
Kimandazi, tunabebewa kimandazi from what front?
I mean, why should it be news that a president has met his deputy?
The Standard has carried out very differently.
You know,
peace walk. If you may just pick it up and
the thing
for them
here
to see.
is, you know, peace walk. I mean, peace walk with Raila, yes, because they had issues. You know, the opposition and then the handshake. But with a member of his, I'm not blaming the media here. I'm basically blaming the political class that this should not happen, Dibal. If today there is a cabinet secretary that does not agree with the president, the appointing authority,
Resign.
you resign. If the deputy president does not agree with the president in the manner that which corruption is being fought, he should resign. Yeah, that's the way decent states operate, and statesmen and women operate.
So do you think, Irongo Houghton, or Hanenja on this matter, we overplayed our hands on this particular matter? Because we say, yes, there was no rift or any growing rift. This is our perception, but from what we see, there was no growing rift at all. So we overplayed our hands as media?
First of all, I didn't say there is no rift. I said I have no ground. It's all speculation. Okay. And it's all speculation because of the noise that the puppies are making. And occasionally, you know, the leaders are saying, and so we say, well, perhaps there's actually trouble here. They could be living very peacefully in their house. Now, of course, what is going on, it does not look good. And so that is what leads people to speculate, but perhaps there is a rift between the president and his deputy. And of course, the media may go ahead and highlight, in part because of, you just saw the puppies on TV right now making noise. So it leaves you to wonder, okay, these puppies keep making noise, why can't they be, you know, be silenced? You know, there must be something going on, must be something cooking. So of course the media has to speculate. But as Dr. Mustafa is saying, you know, it shouldn't be a surprise, shouldn't even be news when a president meets the vice president. But what I would like to remind Dr. Mustafa, though, is, you know, in Kenya, generally, leaders don't resign. They have to get fired or they die. So we don't really expect to, though they disagree.
Or they resign after death. I see
Yes.
on the cartoon.
So I think the point Mustafa raises is an important point, which is at what point, if the deputy president feels that he can no longer work with the president, will he resign? Now, we saw this in the case of Polycarp Igade and Governor Sonko, that at some point the rift between them began to be too wide for them to be able to work together, and Polycarp resigned. So there is
a professional resigned.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's right.
And there are cases. I mean, I think the difference, and this is where perhaps I would differ with my colleague here, is that leaders do resign. Politicians don't.
Yeah,
and the difference between the two is really the capacity to step away from something that is untenable. So I think the question that's being raised here is an interesting one. At what point, if there is a policy gap, or if the deputy president feels that he is now vulnerable and is being maligned in public and his principle is not protecting him, would he resign?
All right.
That's true.
Gracias, Boncha.
Yeah. I don't like to massage clear facts to try and, you know, bring out a very different picture. I mean, if you've been watching the Kenyan news for the last 4 or 5 days, you saw these tensions rising. When a very senior member of society, for that matter, a senator, says they are going to bring an impeachment motion. First of all, I like to ask Irungu here. I don't know whether you can say that it could not have legal basis, because I mean, if you go into history of impeachment, and I have been in a position that I'm elected on a ticket with my boss, who's chair and I'm deputy, it doesn't follow that if the chair is impeached, that the deputy is automatically impeached, because I have held that political position. So it doesn't follow, because you commit crime or, you know, sins individually. Having said that, I think we cannot pretend that there was no sense of tension. I mean, if you look at the tone with the people speak and the seminars that, or funerals, people attending funerals, and all they're talking about is 2022 and throwing mud at each other. It's not healthy for the country. And that's why the president has been saying, let's focus on 2022. I can see that the president is losing battle on that, to the extent that many people now are starting to say, okay, if only we can even win the war against corruption, leave alone the 4 agenda, that would be a good, you know, take home. I mean, this is, you can see that we are now resigning to saying, if only we can fight corruption, that is all we would have achieved. Are we creating jobs? Are we creating houses? Are we feeding our people? There is hunger. People are standing here on TV saying nobody has died. And you can see it's all meant to veneer and keep the situation look normal. It is not normal.
Well, my colleagues here are correct. Kenya people are saying enough is enough. This country has been looted for over 50 years. And we are saying we can no longer take it anymore. We want a leader who will take a bold step to eliminate corruption through legislation, through law enforcement, round up these people, lock them up, so that the little kid who ran out who is born and cannot eat, the people in Turkana who are dying, the healthcare, the young people we are teaching at university that cannot afford 5,000, 10,000 in order to go to school, will be able to have opportunity to go to school. This is no game. 2022 don't mean anything to ordinary Kenya. It's not bringing food to their table. It's not creating employment for them. All these other political shenanigans are meaningless to Kenya. Let's keep the eye on the prize. We must eliminate corruption in the country.
Right, thanks.
In just one sentence, Dibal, if we fail this time around to actually deal with this issue of corruption, that's it for Kenya. Security-wise, that's it.
Yeah.
Kenya may not collapse tomorrow or next year or 2022, but in the next 10 years, I don't think we'll have much of a country to speak about if we lose this war on corruption today.
All right. Okay. And of course, corruption is a big threat to security. You're watching Standing on Guard, where we keep an eye on the enemy. And of course, also, we are here to discuss issues of security and global affairs. But still on the front page of Daily Nation, I think this should pick up our interest as well. The student who joined Al-Shabaab, this is Imani Ali, wanted to become an engineer before he was radicalized. Reports suggest that the former JKUAT student was killed in Somalia last Friday. I don't know if you've been following this particular story, Mustafa, or our panelists, as far as, and we can just expand on what is truly happening on this just briefly. It will be remiss of us not to really pick it up and discuss about it, about this radicalization, especially of very bright students. We saw this happening also in the UK with ICs. If you can remember Mohammed Mwazi as well, who was also an IT student, very bright, so to speak. And the radicalization, it despairs no one, right? It doesn't mean that you're coming from the push factors will be, again, maybe, so to speak, poverty. But looking at this, some of these students, their backgrounds, they come from very well-to-do families as well. First of all, can we just discuss about Iman Ali, who, if you read the report this morning, he's the one actually who orchestrated what we had, I think, in 2017, the El Ade, right? The attack in Somali that actually took a lot of our soldiers as well. Let's just begin from there.
Yeah, thank you, Dibal. Kimanthi Abu Zinira Ali Iman was the head of Jaish al-Ayman in Somalia, within the ranks and file of Al-Shabaab terror group. He rose through the ranks because of his intellect. He was very intelligent. He basically was responsible for setting up the ideological infrastructure in this country, together, of course, with others who have died, or others who are still alive, the ideological infrastructure of terror that saw the recruitment of many Kenyans, particularly from Majengo, just a stone throw away from here in Eastlands. He grew up, if you look at the family setting that Iman grew up, he didn't have his father. And this is the important point, that the lack of a father figure amongst all these people, in fact 99% of all these people did not see their fathers as such, or their fathers were absent in their lives. Like Iman, the mother kept on getting married to, I don't know, 7 different men. Family is something, the lack of family upbringing or the breakdown of families plays havoc on the minds of children. And this bright young man who was studying engineering here at Jomo Kenyatta International, JKUAT, was destined to be a professional, but he fell into the hands of another recruiter then, who brainwashed him to join Al-Shabaab. Now, if you look at the conditions, the push factors that Dibal you're talking about, in Majengo here, very apt for pushing young men and women to join these violent extremist groups. And then don't forget there are pull factors on the other side that is pulling them. The appeal, the charismatic leaders that are there, the promises to better life, Dibal, the sense of taking their lives in their own hands and destiny in their own hands has been playing a huge role. And this is the way we lost Iman to Al-Shabaab is the way we have been losing many young people to Al-Shabaab and ISIS. This man committed or planned and committed horrendous acts of terror on Kenyan soil, inside Somalia. He, together with Gama Dere, who was killed in Somalia, were responsible for the most horrendous, macabre terror attacks in the country, including Westgate and Garissa.
Dr. Hassan Khanenje?
Now the Dr. Mustafa has covered most of what I wanted
He's
to.
done a great job, huh?
Yeah, he's done a great job and,
Thank you.
and stole all our thunder, which is not very helpful. Yeah, but
So let's see you struggle.
It's always good news, okay, to know that a man responsible for the murder of literally hundreds of Kenyans, both in Kenya and outside Kenya, especially for the men and women in uniform who are serving in Somalia, has been brought to an end. It is supposed, of course, it's sad, but at the same time, is good news. It is sad because he would be making positive contribution to this country today, had he not gotten radicalized. Now, Iman is also an example of, because we've had lots of intervention programs, especially with regard to arresting the situation of radicalization and extremism. And sometimes I think we overwhelmingly focus on people who are less educated, thinking perhaps that is going to make them more vulnerable to radicalization. The truth is, recruiters and also Babu ISIS, they are pretty smart. And they would like to get the best most of the time. And I always remind people that 15 out of 19 hijackers during September 11 were actually from Saudi Arabia, very wealthy families, well-to-do families. Some of them had trained in top aviation schools in the United States. And so the profile of a would-be terrorist, generally, you would not have expected them to be part of that. But of course they were. Now, as Dr. Mustafa has explained, you have push and pull factors. But I think we focus so much on poverty and, let's say, illiteracy. There are other factors at play that we need to address as a country and as the international community, especially with regard to this. It is perfectly fine. We've had cases of sons, mostly, and even daughters of fairly prominent people, even in this country, who've actually joined terrorist organizations. And sometimes it's not that the parent was exactly missing, actually was there, but perhaps we're just not paying enough attention. But also sometimes because recruiters kind of know our weakness and they know our vulnerabilities, so they find ways of recruiting, of accessing this with messages can actually appeal to them. Either sense of alienation, because alienation is not just about being marginalized. It's the reason we're having kids from Minneapolis travel all the way. Some of them were actually born in Minneapolis in the US, and they're coming to Somalia to join Al-Shabaab. Why is that? So it is important that, we have to increase our, move away from some of this strict profiling and see, okay, what are other reasons? How is Al-Shabaab or ISIS operating to the extent where they can actually be able to recruit the best among us? If we don't move towards that direction, I think there are certain areas where we're going to lose.
And maybe, Irungu, we can actually also take this as a segue to the closure of the Dadaab refugee camp, which it seems the government is making good of its promise to actually close it by August this year. What does this portend really for security around the region and in the country as well? Because this also has been a hotbed maybe of, trying to maybe groom terrorists in this country. And that's why I think that's a prime solution that the government sees to tackle terrorism in this country, because this is where we've been breeding terrorists in this country. But what does it portend on a humanitarian note? Because I think, we have also ratified on the international conventions as well, and people have been crying foul around this particular debate of closing the Dadaab refugee camp.
So thank you very much. I think it is very much linked, and I'd like to bring a human rights perspective, but also a security perspective to the conversation around the potential for closure of Dadaab. Now, what do we know? Your sister paper on Monday, the East African, basically carrying an AFP story, said that the government has indicated an intention to close Dadaab by August. So this is a unfolding news story. For those of us who have worked very closely on humanitarian and human rights issues, there's obviously the danger of what does this actually mean? In the absence of coordinated planning, consultation, and a return to peace in Somalia, does it portend does it actually begin to give us glimmers of a human rights and a humanitarian disaster that would happen in August? We're not sure quite what this means. I mean, was it part of the dispute between Somalia and Kenya early in the year, particularly around the Maritime dispute, or is there actually a real intention to close the camp, despite the High Court judgment of 2017 that this would be unconstitutional? But what we do know is the impact of this, if it is done in a clumsy way, would be to simply tip to about 230,000 people back into Somalia, most of whom have been in Kenya since the 1990s, speak Kiswahili fluently, have seen Kenya as their home territory, and essentially put them back into an environment that is not tenable, either from a livelihoods perspective or even from a safety perspective. And I think what we can only assume is that they would be immediately grounds for terrorists to recruit many of these people who now essentially are familiar with the country, they feel rejected by the country, and just swell the ranks of Al-Shabaab. So I think, for me, from a security point of view, this is extremely worrying if this is the direction that the government is going. But I think it would be important for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to actually clarify this position and indicate that this is not actually the case, but that they, this is no longer the case, that perhaps they were looking at this in January, but they are now looking at a different model. I mean, there are different models that the government could pursue, which include, for example, inclusion and integration within Garissa, and therefore many of these people who are really Kenyans, and they may have come from historically Somalia, but these are not necessarily foreigners to this country. And I think for Kimanzi and Ali and others, what we've learned is that expulsion and exclusion are the first, the first triggers for radicalization. So from a security perspective, I think this would be misadvised and probably also embroil us further in a situation where actually, to be honest, based on what we've seen in this particular case, military operations inside Somalia and also the protection of Kenyan citizens, as we saw in Dusit, has become much more effective than it has been in the past. Right.
We'll take a short break on that note. When we circle back, we continue with this discussion and a raft of other issues as well. Also feeding into that is the drawing of Somali troops as well from AMISOM. What does it really portend also for the security of Somaliland, who are headed to the elections in 2020? So we actually will be peeling back on that and trying to get granular and understand what it will portend as far as security is concerned in the region. Don't go away, much more coming up on the other side of the break. And right now we are turning our focus on the closure of Dadaab camp, that is the refugee camp that it seems the government is making good of its promise to close it in August this year. As they had promised, they were giving a 6-month window period. And we are actually discussing this with our panelists and a raft of other issues as far as security is concerned. But also the story that was on the front page of a Daily Nation regarding the man Ali who was killed in Somalia and was a key leader as far as Al-Shabaab is concerned is a critical story also fitting into what we're talking about with the refugee camp, because this is where we have the brewing ground for the terrorism. But there's so many issues that even off camera we were just discussing as far as the refugee camp is concerned. Kanenje, I think it was your turn, and you're saying that a refugee camp is not an embassy. So if you're born within the refugee camp, I don't know what those stipulates, you're the experts, you can tell me. Are you a Kenyan?
Yeah, number one, first of all, I'm not an expert in international humanitarian law. However, the reason I say that the refugee camp is not an embassy, because an embassy is technically a foreign territory.
Yes.
A refugee camp could be a refugee camp for locals who are internally displaced, or for foreigners, or sometimes a mixture of both. And we have seen it, happen very often. Now, the last time I think I checked, perhaps something has been reviewed, I would like to be reminded that a child born in Kenya is supposed to be Kenyan. unless, let's say, you were born in an embassy, which again is technically a foreign territory. Now, it is true that when you're a refugee, you're given a document. And if you seek to be a refugee, because the Kenyans we know who decided to become refugees so they can actually be settled in foreign countries, then you cease being a citizen of this country. However, how about the children of these refugees who did not apply to be refugees? If their parents applied to be refugees in 1993, themselves they were born without having a choice to make, whether they wanted to be refugees because they were born in a country called Kenya. They do not know any other country. They probably don't even speak some other languages. Some of them only speak either Somali and Swahili, or some of them, their Somali is pretty bad, actually. That's why they call them sometimes, Somali Sijuis. And so if we wake up one morning and say we are shipping all these people across the border, first of all, they don't even have a home where they're going. They don't really know that. Now, if our declarations about closing is for strategic reasons, it is one thing, because we also know that we've not been receiving sufficient support from the international community the way we actually should, given that Dadaab is the largest refugee camp on earth as we speak today. But at the same time, we should perhaps, like what some countries do, because some of these young people in these camps, who are actually a majority of them were born in this country, they are extremely talented. They extremely have a lot of knowledge. They have a lot of ambition. There is a chance that we can provide, not to all, some path to citizenship to some of these refugees, so we can integrate them within the larger community, either in the regions where the refugee is or in other places, if they meet certain standards, so they can contribute to the economy. Because chances are, frankly speaking, it's going to be very difficult. Now, number two, we have the security issue. What do you think is going to happen to people who you're going to overnight expel them to Somalia when they have no means, they have no support, because there is no one waiting for them on the other end? Somalia itself can barely hold its own in Mogadishu, let alone other parts of Somalia. So we have to be very careful, because it can actually increase the threat and, in fact, increase the ranks and bulk the numbers of Al-Shabaab overnight, because these people are hopeless, and there is nothing like a hopeless young man or woman who has nothing to lose.
All right. Hughton.
So the only thing I would want to add is just what's interesting about this particular announcement at the moment is that actually we've just seen a number of loans and grants signed by the government with regards to infrastructural development and social development programs in the Dadaab area, and it's not just in the broader Garissa. So the government has signed agreements with the World Bank, with the British government, and also the European Union. And it seems to be interesting that this announcement should happen parallel to what seems to be a long-term investment in trying to make the camp and Garissa much more viable economically. So I think, again, I hope that this is not still the case, and that essentially what has been revealed by the East African as being a statement in February is not being carried forward now that there seems to be a dialogue between the Somali government and the Kenyan government.
But around are we getting clarity? I think I didn't hear from you to clarify on the status of citizenship. If you are born in Kenya, I wanted just to hear what will be the position of I don't know if you'll speak for the Amnesty International and just give us a clarification on this as well.
No, we're clear within Amnesty International that these are refugees. I don't think there is a claim that these are Kenyans. I think what I was just saying is that these have been...
so if you're born within the camp, is you still a refugee?
You would still be a refugee.
You still be
correct,
a refugee?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, there is a convention, and I thought Mustafa would have commented on this, for the rights of children globally, which says that every child shall be entitled to a citizenship. And if a child is born in a country and they apply for citizenship in that country before they are 18 years old, they should be automatically entitled, unless they are criminals or they have committed or they choose not to. And so there is a convention that guarantees that. And I don't think this discussion here should confuse the closing of the Dadaab, on children and the closure of the camp. Let's talk on the merits of the camp itself. As Irungwa said, you have about 230,000 people have been there. This is not the first time this debate has occurred. This is not the first time Kenya has given indication that they want to repatriate the refugees, and already over 80,000 have already left, provided there is also international convention which governs return of refugees. They do it voluntarily and not forced. Now, if Kenya can prove that that is the case, don't put them in trucks and use force to close the camp and send them away. That would be quite very much legal. And of course, when you talk of refugees is not a homogeneous subject because refugees are of various categories. There are refugees who are political, who have run away from persecution, either color or political views, but there are also those who have run away because conditions which existed in the country because of war, there was nothing to do with their persecution. But if conditions have improved and you want to send them back, that is okay. But is the condition in Somalia okay now to receive refugees? I can't know. And I'm not sure that that assessment has been done. You mentioned earlier on about the best practices. The best practices, I mean, one country that I know that has used this very effectively is Sweden. If you arrive in Sweden as a refugee, you are not put in one camp. You have seen what has happened in France. Because all these people from Middle East are kept in one camp, France is now getting into a situation of racial tension. The best practice is to assimilate them, distribute them around the country, and have them integrated in society. Uganda has tried that. Uganda does that, but of course they keep them within an environment. They give them land to deal, and in fact they try to get them to be self-supporting. But at the end of it, this is a highly emotive subject, complicated. It has changed the politics in the world. That's why people are building walls. That's why politics in Europe is changed. And it's a subject that we must not lose sight on. It's not going to run away from us. We may need to go back to the drawing board and say, is it time again we came up with a better convention on how to handle refugees?
Right. Professor Nomidamba.
Dubal, there, like my friend Ambassador said, this is a very complex issue. But here's the point. On one hand, Kenya must act on its best national interest. There is all evidence point that there's connection between Westgate and Dadaab camp, between Garissa attack and Dadaab camp, between recent Dusit attack and Dadaab camp. All right, there are three, in my opinion, three options. One option was to have these people distributed in a number of African countries. So we don't create this huge camp, okay, called refugees camp, the largest, I think the largest in the world. So Tanzania takes some, Mozambique takes some, Zambia, everybody takes some, okay? And then you have the human way of organizing such that these people behave more like human rather than in a military camp kept together. That was option number one, which we missed from the beginning. Number two is to create an integration, like our friends have said. The impact of the Second World War is that German prisoners were distributed all over the Western countries. Some end in America, some were in Ireland, some, they were all over the place. And when the war ended, they returned. Some returned to Germany, some decide to stay as Americans, and all others. We should have thought about that. Returning those refugees, particularly by force, is not the answer. There is very clear indication that the ones who have returned wish to return, and actually some have returned through other ways. So this is not going to solve the problem. We are going to create more monies because these people will become much more violent than what we're seeing.
Well, but since 2011, since when we had the Dadaab camp being put up to now, it seems, yes, there is no strategy or planning on how they're going to sort of have the close of the camp. And I think, yes, the Kenyan government in a way, has the right to say, oh, it's been, your stay has been long overdue. And right now, we are thinking, because also of the security of the country, we need now to close this particular camp. As it says, it shouldn't be Kenya actually bearing the burden and the brunt of all this. Of course, we've opened our borders to them. This is a human gesture. But I think over time, it has been overlooked by the international community. And the resources also are limited as far as running these camps are concerned. So on that note, what would have been the plan since we had this particular refugee camp? And it has exceeded, I think, the numbers that a refugee camp should actually ideally hold in the first place.
Yeah, and Dibal, therein on what you're talking about lies the problem. Refugees are not supposed to be permanent. And there's a huge failure on the part of the international community, actually, to ease the burden on Kenya with regard to this particular issue of refugees. Dadaab is one of the largest single refugee camps. We have over 200,000 people living there. Now, Kenya has experienced the burden. The terrorist attack at Westgate was planned, designed, conceptualized, planned from Dadaab refugee camp by a few people. So that should not be the reason why the camp is actually being closed. But there must be ways actually to deal with such kind of threats. Otherwise, you don't jeopardize the security of 230,000 refugees because 5 decided to use a refugee camp to plan an attack. Now, aside from this failure of the international community to actually ease the burden on Kenya, there are dilemmas here: political dilemma, ethical dilemma, and security dilemma with regard to this particular issue of camp. Ambassador Mwencha pointed in this direction with regard to children. And Ambassador Mwencha is right. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, which was agreed to by state parties in 1989 in New York and ratified today, is the most ratified human rights treaty in the world. Is very clear on this matter. The best interest of the child is taken care of at all times, Dibal. Irrespective, at all times. And so these are some of the issues that Kenya will have to deal with. But the international community has got to come in here. I don't think Kenya on its own can deal with this issue. It's a very complex issue, Dibal, and I'm hoping that the international community will have to deal with it. But here is the main point, Dibal. There are tensions building up between Kenya and Somalia with regard to the maritime dispute. And first of all, I expect Somalia to actually not do the things that it is doing at the moment with regard to that stretch of waters that clearly belongs to Kenya. And so trying to auction Block 230, 231, 232, 233 obviously will enrage Kenya and say, we have been hosting you here for the last how many years? 30 years? Yes. It's almost becoming permanent. And so Somalia has to take a few steps back and say, look here, we are so much closely connected to Kenya, not just in terms of the refugees, business. And many other security issues, and therefore these two countries have to bilaterally sit and negotiate. And it is expected, or Kenya should naturally expect, that Somalians are going to heed the call and accept or deal with Kenya in a way that Kenya has dealt with it in the past.
And yes, that will be the question. Have they overstayed the welcome so far? And we're caught in this horn, or the sharp horn of dilemma as well. But when we talk about integration, we can see there's so many also refugees who are experts within those particular camps that maybe we do not really tap on their talent as well. We have engineers, we have doctors. And there has been also a big debate on the refugee gap and the labor market. Where do we get the interface? Where do we get the integration? How do we tap into these resources? Because we have all these talented guys who sometimes they have the capacity to now even put up device or these IEDs, the improvised explosive devices, because they have the wherewithal, they have also the knowledge on how to do it. But if they're not integrated into the labor market as well, that is another question. But again, we are caught up on another dilemma. Do we offer jobs to refugees who are in this country, or do we also focus on our own, where we have a youth bulge and they're not also integrated into the labor market?
Yeah, Ibal. At some point, I think Dadaab had more than 500,000 refugees. So actually, what we have right now is about half of what it used to be, full capacity. Now, I don't think that the two are not mutually exclusive. Now, it is true that we've not been receiving enough support. Perhaps we should try to get more support from the international community. It's extremely dangerous to have 300,000 jobless people, okay, with really, really no real prospect that they will ever be anything. It's too dangerous. Number two, it is true that some of these people are very talented. In mid-90s, a young man from a refugee camp in this country moved to Canada, and today as we speak, he is Canada's Minister for Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. Later on, a young girl from Dadaab refugee camp moved to the United States, and as we speak, Ilhan Omar, she's the first hijabi Somali American congresswoman in the US Congress. And so they also have a lot of potential, but we have to find a way of either making them productive, because we cannot, it's not that if they stay there welcome, it is not their choice. Tell me something. Just the other day, you saw bombings and explosions in Somalia. They killed people. A week doesn't pass by. How do you expect some of these people to go back to a place where they don't even understand? They don't even know, you know. Now, of course, Kenya is frustrated, and genuinely so. We've had this going on for a very long time, and it's true, it also poses national security issues, basically because of the reasons I've stated. You cannot have 300,000 idle people. But more than that, that is just one dynamic of actually the security threats we face in this country. There are many other factors, because you're going to be surprised. A number of the terrorist groups who are technically supposed to be having refugee documents, they have Kenyan IDs.
And there are Kenyans who have refugee documents.
And there are Kenyans who have refugee documents. In fact, things have been pretty bad lately since Donald Trump says he's not be getting people from certain parts of the world, because then it's no longer attractive to become a refugee, because you're not going to end up, at least in the United States, you may end up in Canada and elsewhere. Like, how is that happening? Because we are also facilitating this. And that is why at the beginning of our discussion, we are talking about corruption is actually bigger when it comes to national security than those refugees. But at the same time, we cannot perpetually, ad infinitum, have 300,000 unemployed, helpless people in a camp. A way has to be found. If we have to close it, how are we going to close it? That is why I think we should make some noise as a country. We should be more proactive in trying to make sure that, hey, people pay attention, because shipping these people back to Somalia, all of them in one day, number one, is actually against international humanitarian law. Having them stay ad infinitum is not something sustainable. And so either, as we were suggesting, we find a way of integrating some of them or splitting them into different parts, so there is not large concentrations of too many people in one place, find a way of establishing an economic activity that people can engage in and feel productive, instead of you're just there to be fed by the international community and the Kenyan government to take care of you. Right. It's not something that is sustainable in the long run.
Okay. Irumu?
I think the durable solution is probably just three actions that need to be taken. The first is we must stabilize Somalia. That is the first one. That is what actually resolves this entire challenge that we face. The second area really relates to those countries that have the capacity to increase humanitarian assistance. We've seen a 30% drop in humanitarian assistance over the last few years. So the humanitarian assistance must be increased. And for those countries, I think has been said already, for those countries that are able to allow for resettlement, many of these refugees could be resettled in those countries. And of course, we've seen the impact of that in Canada and the US more recently in terms of these appointments. And I think the third thing that we really need to think about is how do we include, or even better, integrate these communities into the rest of the country. They don't necessarily have to be retained in one county, for example. But I think the idea that we should pursue a policy of frustration and fatigue is probably going to be self-defeating as we take a decision that actually increases or exacerbates the security condition that we are currently facing.
Mm-hmm. But also, as human rights organizations, sometimes, of course, we have collateral damage that really occurs when we're having all this war on terror as well. And this is where there has been not an even kill, you know, from the humanitarian perspective and also from the war on terror. Like what Amnesty has done. I think also the East African carried this particular story where you're accusing the U.S. Forces of possible war crimes in drone strikes as well. This was inside the East African. This is the latest edition, if not really picked up this. And it says that a damning new report by Amnesty International accuses U.S. military forces of killing at least 14 civilians and injuring 8 others in Somalia over the past 2 years. The investigations entitled The Hidden War in Somalia investigated 5 out of 100 U.S. airstrikes carried out by Reaper drones and manned aircraft in the lower Shabelle region outside the capital, Mogadishu. Maybe you want to comment on this, because I think this is where we are actually caught in between. How do you caught into the crosshairs? How do you then try and decimate, you know, the terrorists and also keep the civilians safe as well? Because there has to be collateral damage one way or the other.
So I think to start off with the assumption that there has to be collateral damage is to essentially say something extremely simple about something that's actually quite dangerous. So if you are dropping bombs indiscriminately in different parts of Somalia without proper intelligence, without proper analysis, you're not actually supporting the war against terror. You are essentially expanding the war against terror, because I think for every person that feels that their community were unjustly targeted or that they died as a result of a strike and were innocent, you essentially increase the support for extremism and military, the military threat that Al-Shabaab is. And we've seen that, for example, in Operation Sanitization Isli back in 2014, where there was an attempt to just simply arrest, almost without discrimination, a number of Somalis. So I think the war has to be focused and it has to be surgical. And I think this report, which we released last week, it was Amnesty United States of America that did this, essentially demonstrated that many of the drone strikes, and we just looked at 5, I think we looked at about 15 incidents, and we saw a number of casualties that have been demonstrated through our research to have been essentially civilians, not combatants, not members of Al-Shabaab, who were killed as the American government was trying to target Al-Shabaab. And what we noted in that report also is that there's increasing use of drone technology. This is the new face of counterterrorism. And it is convenient to the United States government because it does not pose any threat to their own soldiers. But the danger of them is that if you get the intelligence wrong and if you get the, the location of the drone strikes wrong, you will actually kill a number of civilians.
Erastus Moincha.
I think that point is well put, but I want to go back to this closure issue. If the government chooses to close the camp, it doesn't mean that the refugees must go to Somalia. Refugees have also got some rights. They can name a country, a third country to which they can go, and the obligation of Kenya is to also facilitate that movement by giving them travel documents. Of course, we know that in Europe, this is a highly contentious subject. It has changed the politics of Europe. And I am aware of, I was part of that discussion between Europe and Africa that took place in Malta, where Europe is cooperation between Europe and Africa is premised on migration. And that is because of refugees that came from Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and the rest, much of which could also be the problem created by the world itself, the international community. They went and bombed Libya, created a stateless, nation. A country that has no state to govern it, and therefore it became a route for refugees to go, and of course there are also push factors. I think we need now to go back, as we have said before, to look at this subject again globally, so that countries like Kenya cannot take a disproportionate, share of this burden.
Yes.
I mean, if you look at the number of refugees around the world, it's about 65 million. Most of them are in developing countries. But the developed countries behave as if, they are hurting more. And yet, actually, countries like Kenya are taking more of refugees. So much as we might say, okay, let's be humane and the rest, this should be a call to all of us globally that we must take our responsibilities. And as long as we hide and bury our head under the sand as if nothing is going wrong, only take care of the problems of refugees because they are worried about demographic changes, they are worried about economy. But how about in those countries where they are? And Europe was itself refugee, because if you look at the Middle Age, Europe, exodus to America, exodus to Australia, Canada, those were refugees, but we are forgotten. We are now turned our back and we are saying we are fine because we are worried about the change of politics in our national level.
Okay.
The continent of Africa must have answer to its own problem. Because the doors being closed in Europe, the doors being closed in America, the doors being closed in Australia and other places, we say we don't need you here. Go back to your huts in Africa. And therefore, the skirmishes and war are going to continue in the continent. We're going to fight over water, we're going to fight over boundary, we're going to fight over other things, which is going to create more refugees. We don't know where the next one, where it's coming from. And we cannot turn our back and say we don't need them. We must have answer. Some of the things we have outlined here is integration. To what extent you can bring these people to become breadwinners, become part of the economy. And then some make a choice to go to other places. And so to just throw our arms and then look at the global picture and say you are not doing enough is not good enough for the continent of Africa. But now let me say one thing about the drones and the fight which is taking place. Collateral damage are a very commonplace when you fight a war like ISIS, because the tendency is to hide within the human cell, within civilians. And once you pinpoint where the particular subject is, that subject is covered by about 10 civilians around. Do you make a choice not to hit? It's a very tough call.
Right, thank you. The Refugee Act, I think that was the amended act, actually, that was not really assented to by the president, because I think this was returned. And this was seeking maybe to, when you're talking about integration, to allow refugees to own land and also be employed in this country. I don't know, because what the civil society, the NGO world, the para-church ministries as well have been doing as far as pushing this envelope for this act to be effected. It has taken a very glacial slowness so far, and I think are we not having the political motivation to have this particular act, this Refugee Act, enacted? And what is the status of this? How does it also portend when we have a case like the Dadaab camp as well? How does this legislative policy address it?
Yeah, Dibal, what does a refugee wish to have? Basically, it's just to have his or her well-being assured. That means being able to work, earn a living, take care of their families. And I guess that's what that act in particular envisages. It's however a tough call in terms of implementing, but it should be implemented, of course. The bigger challenge here, and Ambassador Mwencha did talk about that, is the global economic regime is such that it just sucks out of the less developed countries. The recent statistics actually indicate For every dollar that comes to, or euro or pound that comes into Africa, 27 goes out to Europe and America. Now, so Africa, or the South is being impoverished. And even being impoverished is an understatement, Dibal, here. Now, you cannot expect that in the conditions that the South is being impoverished, that you have 230,000 refugees being assimilated or absorbed in any country in the South, say Kenya, for example. And this is why we're saying that the West has to take more responsibility in this. Part of the challenges that have created refugees have been directly caused by the United States of America, United Kingdom, and a few other countries in Europe. And therefore, they must take greater responsibility in ensuring that these refugees are taken care of.
Still on my question on the legislative bit, Dr. Mustafa?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a framework. Yeah, I mean, the legislation is a framework. And I said it's very important that, this is implemented. Dibali, in the Constitution of Kenya, it actually says that, none of the Kenyan citizen, it's a right for a Kenyan citizen to actually eat, to have food. Can the country provide food to each and every person in Kenya? And the answer is no. And so again, these are ethical issues. Maybe Irungu, you want to look at it from a human rights perspective and focus on that.
Right.
But Dibal, it's such a, it requires a lot of resources to do that. It can be done, Dibal. It can be done. And therefore, we have to look at this particular legislation in the context of the international humanitarian law, the United Nations Convention on Refugees that, gave life to the UN Commissioner for Refugees. So different countries have different ways of dealing with it. For example, Saudi Arabia, which is not a signatory to the United Nations Convention of the Refugees, and they do not take refugees. It's a very rich country, wealthy. They do not take refugees. What they do, however, is they absorb a few of the refugees, not as refugees, but they go in and work in those countries.
Right, but the president actually didn't shove it away because he didn't want the refugees to really not work or own land in the country. I mean, the prime reason was the fact that there was no public participation, according to Article 1118 of the Constitution. And that is the question that I tend to wonder then. When we talk about public participation, how come the civil society was not involved in this is missing? How come, as I was asking, the parachurch ministries as well, the faith-based organizations were not involved in this? Because I think they carry the burden of this, especially when it comes to humanitarian aid. And when we talk about public participation in this country, we normally have documents which are, being brought on those forums, written somewhere else. Right. And then we actually to sort of endorse those documents. This is not the participation that we desire. We want to be fully involved, right from the beginning. Not that we have documents which have been drafted elsewhere, then they come to be, showcased to the public, and then they say, do you agree with this? Do we fly with that? We want a full integration. So how come did the civil society or this faith-based organization missed on the public participation on this critical document?
So I think, I'm not familiar with the debates that went on prior to the June 2017, kind of vote in Parliament in favor of this particular refugee bill. And if we were, if civil society was not active, if refugee organizations were not active in speaking before the Parliament and engaging the committee, then it was a missed opportunity. But again, I'm not familiar with exactly the specifics. But I think the important thing about the Refugee Act or the bill was that it was not rejected on the grounds of any technical, political, or economic grounds. That the bill was essentially sound, but the president felt that it needed more public participation. What is sad is actually it has not returned to the president. I think that's the big issue, because I think if it had returned, then we would see a way forward, even on the case of Dadaab. Because the act was very clear. It had two parts to it. The first was really that refugees who have professional qualifications, doctors, engineers, and architects, could apply for citizenship and the right to work in Kenya. The second part of it was that they could use land or they could engage in business and employ other Kenyans where that is possible. So there was a real spirit of this act that leaned towards maybe the Swedish model in terms of inclusion and integration. And unfortunately, we missed that opportunity. Now, perhaps we've got a window between now and August. Perhaps for the members of parliament who are watching now and the parliamentary committee, it would be an opportunity to revisit that law prior to the deadline that seems to have been set for the closure of Dadaab. Although we hope that deadline does not meet us in August.
Okay. It does as much.
Well, I think Irungu has tackled it well. The rejection of this bill because of lack of public participation, to me, is not a very serious issue, that it has not gone back to Parliament. I would see this as the President perhaps having been very cautious that given the volatility of, this matter, allowing such a number, because Kenya's got about 500,000 into, with one stroke of a pen, that you want to integrate them would be chaotic. And maybe this should be futuristic to try and then align ourselves to best practices. And I think it must then be that it's not Kenya that can only do this. This is why we have underlined time and again that this is a global problem and we must also have a global solution. No one country can do that.
Right. Nomi Damba, finally.
I think it's Ambassador said right. We have to have a solution to our country. I'm thinking about the land in the north and northeastern province, which is sparsely populated and which can be utilized by skilled people, engineers, physicians, and all other people can be easily integrated in our society, and then move from there because they will be able to employ all other people. This is based on choice if they choose to stay here. But as I say, Africa must open itself such that these people are distributed across the continent of Africa and not necessarily go to Scandinavia and America and the rest of the world.
All right, so finally, maybe just from a position of intent, since this bill, as you've mentioned, the president now rejected it because of not having the aspect of public participation. We don't know where it is at. What action are you willing to take, maybe as a civil society, Irungu, Houghton, and of course also from the academia as well, to try and make sure that this particular envelope is pushed?
I think for a human rights organization, the first point of, the point of engagement is really dialogue. And so we will reach out to the responsible ministries, that we will engage them on this issue. This morning I'm going before the joint committee that is vetting the incoming Inspector General, the Inspector General designate. And I think the more that we engage the democratic institutions, the more the democratic institutions can do their work properly. So the first, I think, is dialogue. The second, of course, if we are pushed to it on the case of Dadaab, will be litigation. And we will litigate from the perspective of the Constitution of Kenya and all international human rights standards. But we always move first to dialogue because we feel that in many ways decisions sometimes are taken in error, they're taken in haste or in frustration with the length of time that it has taken to stabilize Somalia and therefore and also the cost of keeping a camp like this. So that's usually our approach.
Okay. And still, on the front page of East African, troop drawdown in Somalia sharply increases risk. I think at the top of the hour we actually alluded to this, and how we said this will portend, how will it portend for security as well if we have the troops being drawn from some of the Somali bases as well, because some of them also, they've not been paid. How does this, if you've been following this story, also add up to the whole aspect of insecurity or security for that matter? Mustafa.
God, my mind was waiting for the question on Golan Heights.
Yeah, before we go to the Golan Heights, let's we wind up on our region first. We begin at home.
Has a point blank answer to that.
Dr. Khanenje.
You know, any country or any society that does not pay its soldiers is actually in danger of eating itself. Either because of the direct threat that comes from starving soldiers, or because they simply abandon their work and they leave you to fend for yourself, which is extremely dangerous. Now, of course, there's been a lot of noise generally around the region. There's a lot of scramble for the Horn of Africa by foreign powers for different reasons. But one thing we're not paying close attention is what are we doing to actually build the capacity of Somalia. AMISOM is said to pull out, at least based on the timetable they already have. We know that Somalia is still an extremely fragile state. It barely controls Mogadishu, the central government. And when you start seeing things such as this one, then it makes people very pessimistic as far as the war against terror and Al-Shabaab is concerned. And for us as Kenya, it's a direct national security threat for us. And perhaps through our different directorates that are engaged, within the Horn and other parts of the world, mm-hmm. I think we should perhaps increase our lobbying to make sure this doesn't happen. You know, the thing is, we are not just a frontier state. We are the most affected by the crisis in Somalia. And Kenya and Somalia, they're like Siamese twins. We will never really be able to separate ourselves from Somalia or from each other. Neither can they. And so we have most to lose, but also most to gain if we can get things done. Now, of course, we know that there's been a reluctance of the international community sometimes to make robust efforts. But I think we should stay focused and we should lobby aggressively to make sure actually Somalia is stabilized. Because when you see troops not being paid, and here some politicians, Mogadishu, are actually pocketing millions, there's a problem there. Or they're busy trying to auction oil blocks, along our mutual coastline. There's a problem there, as in we cannot just sit back. We should use the forums that we have through IGAD, through the African Union and through the United Nations to make sure that actually more support comes to Somalia, but also the Somali government is held more responsible and accountable.
Right. Nomi Damba.
While in all this debate and all the action, one thing that should be very clear is that we need to focus on our best national interest. That's the reason we went into Somalia. Nation building is a very, very complex, difficult undertaking. And the only people who can do it are the national, the people themselves. We can stay in Somalia for the next 99 years. But if Somalia themselves has not decided to settle and live along with each other, it won't happen. And therefore, number one primary thing is buffer our borders to make sure that it is secured, to make sure that our territorial integrity is intact, that there is no question about somebody auctioning our territorial right, and then support the international community effort to make sure that Somalia is as stable as it can.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay. Just a comment on that. If you throw your mind to DRC, you will see forces that went there in the 60s are still there. And the international community is very much worried that this kind of dependence syndrome or a lack of decisive action can continue for the case of Somalia. This kind of situation rests on two pillars. One is that the international community should help Somalia gain capacity to be able to stand on its own. That capacity has several angles. Mm-hmm. One is to train its own forces. Two, have necessary political climate in the country by gaining reconciliation and laws. The third one, bring development so that you can make it attractive. The third one, of course, then, is the second pillar is for the countries that have brought in forces, they should continue to support that country and withdraw, you know, in a gradual manner. You can't walk away. This is what I agree with President Trump, that you cannot announce a day that you are going to leave, because what these Al-Shabaab will do is go into sleeper cells and wait until you leave, and then they will take over. So that must be must be properly planned. But I don't see this is happening, because if you look at, and this is what the professor has alluded to, Somalia has been unable to organize its own house. There's too much infighting within the government. And there has been lack of progress in a number of areas, particularly economic, bringing in, you know, really tangible growth on the ground. And so you always have desertion. As far as I know, I mean, I was in AU for close to 10 years, we have been having desertions. And desertions will always occur so long as the other side, because if the Al-Shabaab still has got means of supporting their own forces, recruiting from government, people who have arms, they will come and take those forces and arms to continue sustaining the war. So there is, unfortunately, the international community has taken its eyes off, because for them, if Somalia is not a major threat now, there are no refugees living in Somalia, they are in Kenya, there is no threat to them. There are other threats to look at, like Syria and the rest, Yemen, where they see a potential of them trekking to Europe and elsewhere.
Right. Let's just run up on that by seeing reactions also on Twitter. We have Jacob Abere Mtalala saying, closing the Dadaab isn't a solution to insecurity and terrorism in Kenya. It needs a broad, radical policy approach, intelligence, investment, education, and cottage industry policy strategy and absorption. That is when we shall succeed. Also, Anastasia Olembo says, let Kenya learn from Rwanda how they are working with DRC and Burundian refugees. And also we have Njoroge Jambi, who's saying, why give foreigners opportunities instead of giving our own at county level? It is better to invite people from outside to get contracts while we have our own. Where is the Kenya in you? And I think also you can always see a different opinion as far as integration, as what we were talking about is all about. But I don't know what Anastasia, I'm not privy to what Rwanda has done and Burundi has done as far as refugee is concerned that we can benchmark. Maybe you're the expert. If you can actually, you're privy to this, you can let us know. None of you?
Well, as far as I know, in
Yes.
Rwanda, you don't have a particular camps where you keep these refugees. They are all integrated. Unfortunately, many of the refugees, of course, Rwanda's got refugees in DRC and all that. But I think the main thing is just like what we've talked about, they are integrated.
And I think just an adage to that is, you know, those refugees, those who go, Africans go and seek asylum in Israel. I think Rwanda, there's been discussions for Rwanda to accept those refugees and actually being paid $3,500 US per refugee. Well, in many ways circumventing the international laws, so may not offer the best.
Like selling cows.
That is like selling cows. So you have, you know, a state say, you know, you blacks, no, we'll even pay another country to take you. You know, it's terrible.
And talking of Israel, maybe we can also talk about, briefly as we're winding up, the U.S. decision to recognize Israel, you know, Israel's sovereignty of Golan Heights as well. And this has sparked a lot of reactions around the world, and of course Hezbollah as well, and other, you know, facets are not really happy with this particular decision. And they're saying this is purely for the interest of U.S. domestic policy. Just briefly, because we're really stuck for time, can we just highlight on that? Maybe next week we can delve deeper on this and a raft of other issues as far as that.
Just 2 points, Dibal. First of all, is null and void based on a raft of international conventions, laws, treaties, and peremptory norms. There's a difference between sovereignty and suzerainty. Sovereignty basically, another nation can hold land or can take land from another nation during a time of war to ensure its defense. And that's temporary. It cannot go on for long. But this is a classic case of conflict resolution where you escalate and take so much, put in your pocket so that you can dish that out when you are trying to, give and take in any. I think it's linked to the deal, the so-called deal of the century by Jared Kushner and Trump, so that they can give out Golan Heights perhaps in return for something, which I find stupid, actually.
Yeah. All right. Let's hear from Hanenje, briefly.
Donald Trump has reversed decades of U.S. practice, U.S. foreign policy, and in the words of 5 European countries that are members of Security Council, the rules-based international order, rules-based international system. And of course, it's null and void. But what also that does, it makes the prospect of peace in the Middle East even less likely. What he has done a lot of damage. Now, if Trump doesn't win the next election, you can be sure the next U.S. president is actually going to reverse a lot of these decisions he has made. Because generally the U.S. public is not exactly supportive of these. But most importantly, the international community does not recognize both the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, which is supposed to be a final status agreement or negotiations issue, or the grabbed land for the Golan Heights. It does not belong to them, it's grabbed land. But it plays very well with the messianic ideologues in the United States and the evangelical right. And so he's actually doing pretty well, especially when it comes to the Israeli right, the Likud and Netanyahu and the camp. And within the United States, some evangelicals and some right-wing, and of course AIPAC, which is the largest, most powerful Jewish lobby groups in the United States, and extremely conservative, we must say that. And so I don't know what deal Jared Kushner actually has, but there will be no deal. I can tell you that. There will never be a deal under these circumstances.
Right.
So I think Amnesty came out very clearly on this particular case, and we said that the U.S. administration recognition of the attempt to occupy the, to legitimize the Golan Heights and its occupation by the Israeli government was reckless, and it also violates international law. I think this has been said before. It also undermines attempts by the Egyptian government to try and find a ceasefire and a negotiation. So it's undermining regional leadership on this issue as well. I mean, what we know about the Golan Heights, in many ways, from 1967, these were occupied territories. The Israeli government has destroyed hundreds of villages. They've also displaced thousands of people. And it is in complete violation of UN Security Council Resolution 497. So these, it's very clear that in terms of the international community, this is not
it's a violation.
The way to go. The last point, I think, is just two quick points. One is the internal dynamics in the United States are interesting on this issue, because you have seen the rise of white supremacist groups with anti-Semitic positions, and that is also part of the base of Trump. So it's going to be a bit interesting to see how he manages the evangelical and then last one, just for Kenyans, is that I think many people probably have forgotten that the statement that went out on Dusit D2, the attack, by the Al-Shabaab group, actually linked our recognition of the American establishment of a U.S. embassy with the attack. And I think one of the things our military strategists and also our intelligence and our foreign affairs community need to be very careful about is that we don't get drawn into this essential conflagration of U.S. policy.
Thank you. Briefly, as winding up, let's hear from Erastus Mwenche.
Well, the modern terrorism as we know it today goes back to Israeli-Palestinian crisis, when we started to see all these hijacks and the rest. And if we are not careful, and as we have said, we are going to inflame the environment and continue to create an environment for international lack of cooperation, because U.S. unilateralism is not helping at all.
Thank you. Finally, Professor Noami Damba.
2 quick reactions. One is this is the self-interest of Trump and Bibi Netanyahu, who always create crisis at the time of election. Secondly, Golan Heights provide 30% of water need for the state of Israel. and they're now trying to legitimize it and take it by force.
Thank you. Right, we have Kennedy Omogi on Twitter, finally is winding up saying, wars are not won on military might, but speaking to the hearts and minds of people. Continuous military assault hardens the enemy. Also, Dan Iberi, he says, countries are increasingly becoming more nationalistic. Why not Kenya? Why can't we re-examine the sources of insecurity emanating from the camp? By all means, Kenya first. This is what Danny Berry is saying. And also we have Gregory Anyona Mugaka saying, Dr. Hassan should understand who the U.S. sent back to South America. Just that you cannot go back to your home mean that you are, or it means that you are a baggage to the host. Repatriation is the most sustainable option humanly and with dignity. Reactions there on Twitter. I don't give you a chance to actually respond to this, maybe next week because of time. But I want to thank you nonetheless for also your participation on the show as well, and thank our panelists for a very intense discussion we've had this morning. We should do this next week. We stand on guard where we keep our eye on the enemy. So thank you for your valued company. My name is Dibalania.